I'd like to welcome Ross to the One Question podcast. Before we get started, Ross, would you like to introduce yourself and say what your philosophy behind strength and conditioning is?
Hi, Travis. Well, thank you for letting me on the podcast and inviting me. Flattered by the invite.
No worries, mate.
So yeah, philosophy around strength conditioning. It's quite a diverse topic, but I think my main philosophy is trying to keep as up to date as possible with science-based literature. That's a big thing for me because things change very quickly, especially in this sport and in the context of sports science. For example, altitude training was one of the big things 10 years ago, and now it's kind of shunned away, and the costs involved don't really equal the benefits. So that's just an example. Strength and conditioning is quite a broad topic, but the main context around my philosophy is keeping up to date. What does the good quality peer-reviewed journal articles say, but also being able to apply that and being practical in the setting is also important, because what applies for a soccer club in Europe that has billions of dollars doesn't apply for the everyday people, because it's not practical in that sense. That's basically my philosophies.
Can we go back on that a little bit? So
Yep.
You said about altitude training was a big thing about 10 years ago. Was that correct?
Yep. So about 10 years ago, that was quite a big thing, especially in the AFL.
Yeah. What do you think will be the next big thing in like 10 or 20 years from now? 10 years from now.
Next big thing. So I reckon there's a few that are gonna explode. One being velocity-based training. That's been around for a little bit, but I think that's going to explode now with there's a company called Gymware, so they're the gold standard of velocity-based training. So they're just a manufacturer of the linear transducer, and they've actually created a cheaper version of their product, and still highly valid, called Flex. So that's gonna explode, I think, in the years to come. The literature. A bit of a shout out to Jonathan Weekly and Harry Banyard. So Harry's from Swinburne and Jonathan's from ACU. So a bit of a shout out to them.
On the podcast in the next couple of days, I think.
Jonathan?
Yeah, got him booked in.
Oh, well, he's a legend. A bit of a shout out to them. They're doing some awesome research in velocity-based training. So that's going to be one aspect that's going to be huge. I think potentially blood flow restriction training. That's just going to be a bit of a dark horse, I reckon. I think velocity-based training, you can cement that in being basically the new way people and athletes are going to train. Performance benefits, but also giving objective data so the athletes can see, and we can talk about that. We can talk about that all day, about all the benefits. But blood flow restriction training is another one. Been some studies that have shown improvements in strength and hypertrophy. It's just a matter of educating the general public about what it is, and possibly being a little bit more accessible and things like that. It's also worked a lot with clinical patients, so that could be another thing. I think, well, this one technically is already quite popular. Like, it's basically on its peak, but that high intensity interval training, I think that's just going to continue to grow, because it's whether it's athletes or people, I see some clients, and most of the time they want to lose weight or burn fat, something along those lines in the Gen Pop. Most of the time they've got ingrained in their head they have to go for a 5-hour run, or they have to do one slow continuous run for such a long time. And they don't really understand how doing high intensity interval training can, pound for pound burn more calories than the long, slow distance and duration activities. So between the burning of calories and the performance benefits, interval training is the other thing that's just going to continue to peak. But yeah, if I had to have a 1, 2, 3, it'll be VBT, so velocity-based training, high intensity interval training, and blood flow restriction.
Just for the listeners that don't know what velocity-based training is and what blood flow restriction training is, would you ever just touch on that? Because I sort of think everyone knows what high intensity interval training is by now. Well, there's a lot of information on there about that.
Yeah, sure. So velocity-based training is basically the most easiest way to put it is in a gym. So if I've got the squat rack like I do behind me, generally your coach, trainer, whatever might say you're going to do 3 sets of 10, and you've got a prescribed load, which is percentage-based training. So you might say you got 3 sets of 10, and I want you to lift 70% of your 1 rep max. Velocity-based training is, instead of working at a percentage of your 1RM or percentage-based training, you're working at a velocity. So you're working at a speed rather than working at a load. That's the simplest way to put it. There is a bit more to it, but generally where the equipment comes in, so it's just an attachment to the barbell. There are some other brands like Push Band where you can actually wear it on your arm and do things like box jumps and punches and other things that can measure velocity there. But the simplest way to put it, just an attachment on the bar, measures multiple different outcomes, and the main one is velocity. So with velocity, they're able to calculate some other metrics. With blood flow restriction training, again, it's the easiest way to put it is it's like using big blood pressure cuffs. So there's 2 different sizes, one for the upper body, one for the lower body, and completing movements with those on. So imagine getting your blood pressure taken and having the cuff tightly wrapped around your arm or around the top of your thigh. So most of the time, for example, in a bench press, you'd have it top of your arm, so top of the bicep, and doing a squat, you might have it at the top of the thigh. And you might be doing a squat, obviously, for lower body exercise. And all that's doing is it's occluding venous return. So blood is able to get to the muscle, but it's the venous return and the blood exiting the muscle. It's not able to do that when it's done properly. And there's been some studies that have shown some other tools that have used it. So I've seen some studies that have used elastic knee wraps.
Oh yeah.
Like those powerlifting wraps, and instead of pressuring it up and individualizing a pressure in the blood pressure cuffs, you can actually just say 1 to 10. I want this to be as tight as number 7. So you let me know when it's as tight as 7 out of 10. So that's one way. But yeah, so the whole premise behind that is to improve strength and hypertrophy, and that's pretty much how it's done.
Yeah. So with the blood restriction, is it safe to lift heavy weights while using the cuffs, or would you do sort of a lighter rep range? Or
yeah, so you generally go lighter. So you generally go lighter. So you wouldn't do like a 1RM with, or it wouldn't be recommended anyway, to do a 1RM with that on, because you won't be able to for starters. So pretty much most studies have looked at higher rep, lower weight. So like working at 20% up 1RM, going for 20 to 30 reps, for example. That's just a few studies, but that's kind of what you're looking at. So you're not looking at to do 200 kilos, that's your 1RM. You're not looking to get 200 kilos with that on. You might do 15, 20, 30 reps at a much lighter weight. So it might even be, the bar plus 20 kilos each side, and that's quite good. It just obviously depends how strong the athlete is and where they're at. But the good thing about blood flow restriction training, and there's a lot of studies coming about this, is the clinical use. So there's people like obviously can't squat because knee pain, or maybe someone in hospital, they're in bed. So using blood flow restriction, there's 2 different types. So there's a clinical use where basically people are not exercising, so they're they're just resting. So like on a hospital bed, for example, and just by having the cuff on in those positions, might have them on for 10 minutes and then releasing. That's been shown to delay atrophy, muscle atrophy. So basically the muscle waste, if you like. So again, it's one of those things where it's got multiple benefits. Hasn't been talked about a whole heap because people might think it's just all performance, but it does have a fair bit of clinical use as well.
Yeah. So with the velocity-based training stuff, would you say it's easier to sort of monitor fatigue or at least track it?
Good question. I think the biggest difference between your percentage-based training, so your normal training, and velocity-based is strength can vary up to 20% per day, so per athlete. So you might be able to bench press 100 kilos, and then maybe the other day you might only be able to bench press 80, 85.
Yes.
So strength can actually vary quite a lot. Whereas velocity, if we're working on, let's say, power, so we want to build, explosive power, we might say we're going to work at 0.7 meters per second or 0.95 meters per second, and velocity is a constant, so the speed doesn't change. So you can adjust the weight, but the speed doesn't change. And depending on what type of, because there's a few different types of velocity-based training, and one of them is velocity loss threshold training. So that's basically not even prescribing reps. So you're just saying, I want you to work at 0.8 meters per second. And once you drop below 5%, 10%, 15%, whatever is the goal and whatever's the main focus for that session. So if it's power, it'll be a lower velocity loss threshold. If it's something like hypertrophy, it'll be larger. You just individualize it like that. So you might have 20 athletes, maybe a soccer club, and some athletes might perform 5 reps, some athletes might perform 20 reps, some athletes might perform 3 reps. So you're just individualizing it by that velocity loss threshold compared to the other velocity-based training, which is basically 3 sets of 10. This is the velocity that I want you to train at. So there's a couple of different ways. Hope that answered the question.
Yeah, no, that's perfect. Thanks for answering those questions. Now, are you ready for the one big question?
Yeah, go for it.
What advice would you give an athlete that wants to improve their sprint speed? So they want to get quicker. Like, is there 2 exercises you could recommend that they should do?
Yes. So again, quite a broad question. And we're talking like with the athlete, are we talking about a team sport athlete or a sprinter specifically, or is this just a general to most athletes?
Just a general, most athletes.
Yep. So it really depends. Obviously, if a 100-meter sprinter wants to get quicker and a back pocket in AFL wants to get quicker, it's going to be quite different. Obviously, the surface is different, but in a general rule of thumb, you can go 2 ways about it. You can work on their strength and power in the gym, and then you can also work out on the track. And I think both of them go hand in hand and blend well together. And when I say work on the track, actually working on the specificity of sprinting. Most people reach their top speed between 60 to 80 meters or 60 to 100 meters.
Yeah.
Getting those sprints, to reach maximum velocity is pretty important. Acceleration is pretty important. So getting those different drills is really, really important. But it's also important to work on strength and power in the gym. Obviously, starting off with strength, because without strength, it's pretty hard to build power. We can't really build power. So, there are a couple of ways, if you want to incorporate plyometrics to either session as well, that's really, really good way to improve that elastic power, if you like. Doing things like box jumps and broad jumps and single leg broad jumps and, all about landing mechanics. So there's a whole different ways, there's a lot of different ways you can approach it. And you can even bring it down to the technique, looking at someone, their biomechanics in their movement patterns. But I think generally gym-based and track-based, on the track, working on different speeds and different meterage, if you like. So working on the maximal velocity over that 60 to 80 meter period. And then in the gym, working on a good combination of power movements where the weight's a bit lighter. Potentially you're doing velocity-based training, so you're working at that higher velocity.
Yeah.
And then also working on that more maximal strength training, if you like. So a good balance between the two. And obviously dependent on the athlete and the sport's pretty important.
Yeah, well, on that, could you also recommend there's 2 key exercises you think that are important to develop power, like in the gym?
So 2 exercises, and I'm assuming this is power to translate to speed.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Just the 2. So if I have to pick my best 2, I really like. You can't look past, like, if you're just looking at weights, you can't look past the squat and a deadlift. And again, there's so many ways, and I think if a strength and conditioning coach says this is the only way you can do something, they don't really know what they're talking about, because there's so many different ways and so many beneficial ways to do things. Like I said, velocity-based training, or you can go percentage-based. I prefer the velocity-based route, but to answer the question, squat and deadlift, preferably a trap bar deadlift. I find that the power translates a bit better with the trap bar compared to the barbell. Also, being inside the weight, it's a bit safer on athlete's back. But if you wanted to, because you could use a lot of plyometrics like box jumps as well and broad jumps. But if I had to pick 2, the squat and the deadlift.
Yeah, they're 2 critical ones. Like there's a lot of other options, a lot of exercises you can do, and obviously athletes respond different to different exercises as well. But just 2 critical main lifts that the majority of the population probably do would be squat and deadlift.
Yeah, and that's the thing. So it's not like, you might see on Instagram with someone's got a few thousand followers or 20,000 followers, and probably 19,500 are brought. They've paid for them, and they might come out into, some weird movements and exercise and say, this is the only way you're going to become quick. And it's quite funny, because there are so many ways to do things, and I think sometimes the basics are the best. And not just for speed, I think for strength, I think for, general power and muscular endurance, doing things back to basics with movement patterns is the best, because you got to crawl before you walk, before you run. So, we can't start running because we'll fall over too early.
Thanks for that. I think we'll end it there. I'd like to thank you for coming onto the One Question podcast.
Absolute pleasure. And again, flattered for the invite, and really enjoyed talking to yourself, and make sure we give it a listen.